Hey everybody, welcome to the video. Let's go over the 12-game MLB DFS slate for today on Draftkings. Before we continue, as always, if you guys could just leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, you might as well hit that subscribe button. It's going to be here all season long trying to help you guys become better MLB DFS players that cover other sports as well. So if you're going to keep coming back to the channel each and every single day or each and every single week, you might as well hit that subscribe button and turn the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new videos. You can also follow me over on Twitter. I'm at ChrisPennell16. You can follow me on IG at cpen16. And if you want to support my content over on Patreon, that's always much appreciated. And if you're interested, you hit the link in the description below. But if you are interested, like I already said that twice, wait until tomorrow because it's the very end of the month and Patreon works on the first of the month, so just wait till tomorrow. But if you're interested, like I said, hit the link in the description below. If you're not, that's fine. Let's just dive into today's slate. So up top, we have Darvish. He comes in at 10,500. There is no team total out yet for the Pirates and even the Cubs too. I think they might be waiting on the wind, but it looks like right now the wind is blowing into like diagonal right, which I guess it would look like that on the screen for you guys. That's what it looks like right now. I'm not a weatherman, but just looking at graphs, that's the way it's blowing right now, and that would obviously be a boost to pitching and a downgrade to bats. And that would obviously work in Darvish's favor. Now, his first outing versus Milwaukee didn't go that well. He only threw 73 pitches, but I think we can see that ramp up a little bit. And this is a pretty soft matchup versus the Pirates. They are not the best team in the world. Now, they do not strike out a ton at all versus righties, but we've seen some righties have some success so far versus them this season. And Darvish obviously hasn't like massive upside. I mean, he's got a high K rate at 31%. 31% hard contact rate. Did give up 1.66 home runs per 9 innings last season, which is obviously a little concerning, but this is a pretty soft matchup versus the Pirates. They don't pack a ton of power here. They only have a 99 WRC plus versus righties. 18% strikeout rate, which I don't like, but Darvish can, if he's on, he can overpower a lineup and just rack up the strikeouts. So the price is a little up there, but it looks like the wind's going to be working in his favor. Now, I do prefer going with Mike Clevenger and saving 500, but Darvish is still a fine option. He's always got good strikeout upside, 63% chance for a win in Vegas right now, 7 strikeouts. I'd have to imagine the Pirates are going to have one of the lower team totals on these slates. So Darvish is fine. I'm not sure what I would go with cash games or tournaments yet because it's still early in the morning for this slate. But he feels a little bit more tournament-y to me as of right now, but I could change my mind. Then dropping down to Mike Clevenger, he comes in at 10,000, and the Indians' starting pitching rotation is just on absolute fire so far to start the season. Now I'm an Indians fan, so I'm always usually going to recommend Indians whenever I can. But hey, they've been absolutely hot. And Shane Bieber, man, he followed up his 14 strikeout performance versus the Royals with a 13 strikeout performance versus the Twins. And the Twins are just one of the most prolific offenses in the league. But so far, we've seen them strike out a little bit versus pitcher. We saw Ponce de Leon have some strikeouts versus them. We obviously saw Bieber carve them up. And Mike Clevenger certainly has Bieber-like upside. And one of these things with the Indians pitchers is they've been going deep into the games. We saw Bieber throw about 100 pitches. Clevenger in his last start threw 98 pitches, I believe. So we don't have to worry about like them getting pulled early. They have a long leash, which if you have a long leash early on in the season, you definitely get a boost for me, and Clevenger would qualify there. And Minnesota only has 4.28 runs against him. He's actually a favorite in this game, 54% chance for the win with 7 strikeouts. And if you're looking at Clev's numbers last season, again, he's got really good numbers just like Bieber. I mean, 3.09 xFIP, 34% strikeout rate, 7% walk rate, only 0.71 home runs per 9 innings, so he kept the ball in the ballpark, and that's something you're going to have to do for the Twins because they got a lot of big boppers in the lineup. You got Max Kepler, Nelson Cruz, Polanco, Donaldson, Eddie Rosario. I mean, there's a lot of good hitters in that lineup. Mitch Garver as well, so someone that limited power last season definitely would grade out pretty well versus them, and I think Clevenger could have a pretty good day now. I hate playing guys versus the Twins because they have a ton of power and their just lineup is overall really good, but you also have to think the opposite way that this is a tough matchup for the Twins as well, going up against Clevenger, who definitely has upside. So I think he makes a case as SP1 in the slate over Darvish. I mean, just because, he's got plenty of upside, he's got a long leash, and I think he makes plenty of sense. So I do like Clevenger, and maybe if the Twins keep striking out, that would work out as well. So I don't expect him to throw 13 strikeouts like Bieber did, but I still think he's a fine option. He should be able to get the job done. Then we have Mike Minor. He's 9,200. And he also threw pretty deep into the game versus the Rockies in his first start. I believe he threw 98 pitches. So, again, another guy that we should expect a full workload from. And he gets a really soft matchup versus San Francisco in a spacious pitcher's park in San Francisco. And Vegas likes him, only 3.74 runs against him. He's a favorite, 6 strikeouts. And his numbers last season weren't as good as the other 4 pitchers on this player pool, I guess. But still respectable. 3.59 ERA. Was getting lucky because he did have a 4.6 xFIP, but still he's fine. 23% strikeout rate, less than a double-digit walk rate, 1.3 home runs per 9 innings, 35% hard contact rate. Not my most favorite numbers in the world. He did give up a lot of fly balls at 40%, but I'm pretty much just mostly interested in this matchup here versus the San Francisco Giants. They really struggled with left-handed pitching last season. 23% strikeout rate, 149 ISO, 296 WOBA, 83 WRC plus. I mean, I'm just really all about the matchup here. He went deep into the game last time out. I mean, didn't go like too deep, but he still threw 98 pitches, which I do like. So we should expect probably around 100 pitches. Same with Mike Clevenger. So I think Miner's fine. I prefer Mike Clevenger being my SP1, but I mean, I don't hate Miner or Darvish as well. And then the easiest play on the slate, to be honest, or at least one of them, especially a pitcher, we have Luis Castillo. He comes in AK, and this is just a simple mispricing. He should probably be right around where Clevenger and Darvish is, and if he was, I would still have interest. I mean, Trevor Bauer was originally slated to, I believe he was originally slated to be the pitcher for this game, and he was 10,400, I think, and he was going to be my favorite pitcher on the slate, but obviously the game getting postponed, I forget what day he's pitching. I think might be tomorrow. I might be wrong about that, but either way, Luis Castillo is the pitcher, and he just makes a ton of sense here. He just carved up this Detroit team on July 25th. He threw 11 strikeouts, over 90 pitches. I believe he only gave up 1 run, scored nearly 30 Draftkings points. So, yeah, I want righties versus Detroit, and Castillo has plenty of strikeout upside here. If you're looking at his numbers last season, he had 3.48 xFIP and near 30% strikeout rate. He can walk guys, double-digit walk rate, but this is a good park to pitch in Detroit. Definitely better to pitch here than Great American Ballpark. Only a 26% fly ball rate, kept the ball on the ground at 55% ground balls, and didn't give up a lot of home runs. And this matchup versus Detroit's obviously elite. They had a 26.5% strikeout rate last season versus them, 73 WRC plus, 149 team ISO, 283 WOBA. You gotta like Castillo here. I'd imagine he's going to be the highest owned pitcher on the slate by far. And I totally agree with that because he is just mispriced at 8K for his kind of upside. That's pretty much all the pitchers I'm looking at right now. Obviously, things can change as the day goes on, but just as of right now, that's an early look that pitchers I'm kind of are popping out to me. So I think now we can move on to the batters. And with this being a 12-game slate, there's a lot of batters here I have interest in. What I pretty much do is I just go to DraftKings, go to each position, and I just look at the top and then scroll down, and guys I think look interesting, I put them on the player pool and we talk about. So I'll try to quick hit these guys because I don't want to be here forever talking about each one. But we'll start with Gary Sanchez. He comes in at 4,700. And once again, the Yankees are one of the best plays in the entire slate. They have the highest team total as of right now at 6.16. There's a couple of totals that aren't out yet, but I'd have to imagine the Yankees are going to have the top spot at 6.16 versus the Red Sox pitching, which has not been too great so far this season. If you're looking at Ryan Weber's numbers, he's not that great versus lefties, but still I think everyone's in play here. He was a little bit tougher on righties last season, but only a 17% strikeout rate, only a 14% to lefties. Not too concerned about going up against Ryan Weber. I mean, the Red Sox pitching has just not been that great. Neither the Red Sox just in general so far this season. So I think you can feel free to load up the Yankees bats once again versus Weber in the Red Sox bullpen. If you're looking at Gary Sanchez's numbers versus righties last season, he had a 302 ISO, which is higher than versus lefties, a 545 slugging. And overall, his numbers are going to be good. All the Yankees are in play here. Do not overthink it. Going down to catcher. So you could look at James McCann or Yasmani Grandal. I'm not really sure who's going to be starting, but James McCann, he does have 2 homers so far this season, and he's got some decent splits versus left-handed pitching. Now, they're going up against Chris Bubic, or I would imagine it's Bubic, not Bubic, but he hasn't made a start in the major leagues yet, so I'm always going to give the advantage to the team opposing a new pitcher, especially if he's not expected to be like an ace level kind of guy. And the White Sox do make one of the more interesting stacks on the entire slate. They have a team total of 5.37, which is one of the higher ones, and I definitely have interest in the White Sox here. They're not that expensive either. So James McCann versus lefty, I think he does make sense. I'm not going to have any splits here for Bubic because he has not made any major league starts yet, but McCann's numbers versus lefties do check out. 132 WRC plus and near 300 batting average versus them. Has some pop, has shown some power so far this season, so I think McCann's fine if you are stacking up some White Sox. And then we also have Kurt Casale or Tucker Barnhart. I'm not sure which one's going to start because I think Tucker Barnhart was slated to start last night, but as of right now, I'm saying Kirk Castillo is supposed to be the catcher, but either way, I think both are fine because they're both cheap. But I think the Red Sox make one of the not the Red Sox. I think the Cincinnati Reds make one of the more interesting value stacks on the slate. I think I'm kind of viewing them as the Royals the past couple of days because they're all pretty cheap and they're in a good spot versus Turnbull. I do prefer the lefties versus Turnbull, and I wish they were in Great American Ballpark, but they still grade out pretty well. They have a team total of 5.15, and they're all pretty cheap for the most part, so they're grading out as a pretty good value on this slate. Gasoli's numbers aren't great, but I mean, Turnbull's not the greatest pitcher in the world. Now, he has a much lower strikeout rate versus lefties compared to righties. That's why I prefer the lefties, but I still think this whole lineup isn't played. But I do prefer the lefties, but if you need a cheap catcher, Gasoli's fine, or Tucker Barnhart. And dropping down to first base is absolutely loaded today. I wanted to put like 20 first basemen here, but obviously I'm not going to do that. So just keep in mind there's a lot of good plays here, but Edwin Encarnacion for the White Sox. I think the White Sox make a pretty interesting stack today, and Encarnacion does just smash lefties. He had a 349 ISO versus them last season, 152 WRC plus, and near 600 slugging, 16% walk rate. Again, no stats for Bubic, but I still think the White Sox should be able to have a decent amount of runs scored in this game. So I do like Edwin. Then G-Man Choi, he's 4,400. I really like the Rays today. I think they make one of the top stacks on the slate. They're in a good hitter's park in Camden Yards. Much better hitting there than it is in Tampa Bay. And Alex Cobb, I know he trolled us with the Red Sox stack, I think like last week, but he's not the greatest pitcher in the world, and this Baltimore Orioles bullpen is just absolutely brutal. And not in a good way. It's a good way for the Rays, but not a good way for the Orioles. And I think the Tampa Bay Rays just make a pretty solid target on today's slate. They have one of the higher totals at 5.63. Wouldn't surprise me if that approached near 6 as the day goes on. But G-Man Choi has some pretty good splits versus right-handed pitching. 132 WRC plus versus them, a 275 batting average, 377 on base percentage. I think he graded that pretty well here. If you're looking at Alex Cobb's numbers last season, he had a 375 ISO to lefties, 399 WOBA, and obviously the sample size isn't going to be too big here because he didn't pitch much that season, but the Orioles bullpen's awful. Cobb's not the greatest pitcher ever. I think you can just use as many Rays as you want tonight. I guess tonight if you want to. And staying with the Rays, we have Yandy Diaz. He comes in at 4,200. If you're looking at his splits versus righties compared to lefties, it's going to be pretty poor. I mean, he's pretty good versus lefties. And then if you look at the righties, you're going to see shades of red here. But they're going to get to this bullpen soon enough, and I really wouldn't want to leave off any Rays if you're stacking them, for at least the guys that are hitting up to at the top of the order. So Yandy Diaz, he's got some power in his bat, and it's still not like he's awful versus righties. He still has a 176 ISO, 310 WOBA. But overall, obviously, worse numbers. But I still think he's fine at a pretty fair price tag. I prefer G-Man Choi if you had to pick between the two, but I think both are fine. And then Daniel Murphy. So we have our first Coors Field slate today. Now, I was originally going to have interest in John Gray, but I didn't realize the game was in Coors, so I had to cross that off my list. And if you guys don't know anything about Coors Field, it's always going to have a high total for the most part, especially in the summer when it's hot, because the ball just absolutely carries. They're in the mountains, obviously. They're in the Mile High City in Denver. So the ball carries because the wind, the atmosphere is just, well, I'm not like a weatherman, so it's it's harder to explain for me, but the air is less dense. They're really high, they're high in elevation, and the ball just carries. So, a typical fly ball could end up turning into a home run, so that's why the run totals are usually always higher here, and it's a pitcher's worst nightmare to pitch in Coors Field, especially ones that rely on breaking balls. So I think all the Rockies and the Padres are in play here. Daniel Murphy comes in at a pretty fair price tag, 4,200 to go against the righty and Garrett Richards. Now, Garrett Richards is not a bad pitcher by any means, but we're in Coors Field, so pretty much everybody is in play here. If you're looking at Murphy's splits versus righties last season, they weren't fantastic, but, I mean, still, you're in Coors Field. Obviously, you're going to get a boost here, so I like Murphy. Then dropping down to Jose Abreu. This just goes in with my White Sox stack that I think is pretty interesting today. Jose Abreu is pretty cheap, should be hitting near the top of the order, 4,200, and he had a 232 ISO versus left-handed pitching last season, a 360 batting average, 168 WRC plus. Definitely like Jose Abreu here versus a new pitcher in Chris Bubic. Then Joey Votto, just sticking with the cheap Reds at 4,100. I mean, I know it's not in Great American Ballpark, which is obviously a downgrade for them, but still, I like the lefties here versus Turnbull. He has a much lower strikeout rate versus them, and it's not like he's like an awful pitcher, but I mean, Detroit bullpen's pretty bad, and the Reds have over a 5 implied team total, and compared to their price tags, we're getting really good value on them, so I do like Joey Votto quite a bit. Then dropping down to second base, we have Brandon. It's either Low or Lau. I remember last year I could never get the Lau or Low right, but Either way, low/low, I like the Rays stack here, and he's got some pretty good splits versus right-handed pitching. If we're looking at his splits last season, he had a 265 ISO versus them, a 138 WRC plus, and near 550 slugging. And going up against Alex Cobb and the awful Orioles bullpen, I just think all the Rays are in play here. He's really expensive, but if you're stacking the Rays, it's hard to leave off the number 2 hitter. And then we have DJ LeMahieu. He's 4,100, and we're getting a really good price tag on DJ LeMahieu, especially if you want to stack up these, I keep wanting to say Red Sox. These Yankees, they have the highest implied team total in the slate. They're in a good batter's park, their home field, and the Yankees. And, I mean, he's just got good splits versus lefties and righties. He's better versus lefties, but he's going to be the leadoff hitter. He's only 4,100, and if you're stacking the Yankees up, you can get the leadoff hitter for 4,100, so I think DJ LeMahieu makes plenty of sense, and the Red Sox pitching has just not really been one to be scared of so far this season, so I think DJ makes perfect sense here. Then we have Cesar Hernandez. He comes in at 3,700. He's a much better hitter versus righties than he is lefties. Doesn't have power versus either side of the plate, but he still has better splits versus righties. He's got a 286 batting average versus them compared to 263, higher WRC plus, and just overall much better numbers all around. A little bit more power versus righties as well. Now, Twins pitcher is not the worst guy in the world, but I still think we can use lefties here. He only had a 15% strikeout rate versus lefties last season, and we have plenty of switch hitters in this lineup that will be hitting from the right side of the plate versus Randy Dobnak, or Dobnak. I think it's Dobnak. Could be wrong, but I still think the Indians make pretty interesting play today because they're not that expensive either, and they do have a 4.72 implied team total. And I'm an Indians homer, so whenever I get the chance to recommend them, I will. Whenever they're facing a righty that doesn't have like elite level talent, I'll have some interest. So I think Hernandez is fine, leading off at 3,700. Then dropping out of third base, we have Nolan Arenado. He comes in at a very, very expensive 5,500. But anytime we're in Coors Field and we're not playing against a guy like, Max Scherzer or Garrett Cole, those kind of guys, I'll have some interest in Arenado and Trevor Story pretty much every single time, so I don't want to leave Arenado off. Now, he's a better hitter versus lefties. Like, whenever there's a lefty in Coors, I mean, Nolan Arenado's pretty much a lock that day for the most part. But he's still got good numbers overall versus righties. He had a 573 slugging versus them last season, 258 ISO, 382 WOBA. So if you want to stack up the Coors guys, it makes sense. Now, the problem is pitching is a little bit expensive on this slate, so you can't just go willy-nilly on the Coors Field guys. But if you're using a one-off in there, I don't mind Arenado, but I think I'm gonna probably have a hard time getting a lot of these Coors guys in, so probably won't get too many of them. And plus, you can get the Yankees at pretty much a cheaper price point, which have a higher implied team total. So I don't think Coors Field's a must on this slate, but there definitely should be on your radar just because it is Coors Field and it's the summer and it's gonna be warm there. So the ball should carry if they make contact. And Manny Machado, same thing here. It's pretty much the same thing as Arenado, is that the fact that he's much better versus lefties than he is righties. But Arenado is still much better than righties versus righties than Manny Machado is versus righties. But still, everybody's in play here. It's Coors Field. Going up against John Gray. Now, John Gray's not a bad pitcher, but he's definitely a guy that can struggle at times. Now, he does have upside for sure, but he still gives up a 172 ISO versus right-handed bats, and 24% strikeouts rate's a little bit scary, and he obviously walks less people versus righties as well. But I think everyone on the Padres is definitely in play here because it is Coors Field, so keep that in mind. Now, Machado, the splits don't really add up as much, but Coors Field kind of just evens everything out for the most part. Then Jose Ramirez, he comes in at 4,600. Pretty much all the same things I said about Cesar Hernandez, but obviously Jose Ramirez is a much better player than Hernandez is, and he has much more upside. And I like the price tag we're getting with J-Ram as well. He's got a 239 ISO versus right-handed pitching, 107 WRC plus, and he's a guy that has plenty of upside. And if you're stacking the Indians up, you can't leave J-Ram off because he's one of their best players, him and Lindor. So obviously I will have some interest in J-Ram. And Yohan Moncada, he comes in at 4,400, and I like him better versus right-handed pitching. He's got much better splits. Like, he's got amazing splits versus righties. The lefties, though, he's still fine. It's just not as good versus righties, but still a 201 ISO versus them, a 122 WRC plus. I think the White Sox do make an interesting stack today, and he's at a pretty fair price tag. So I have some interest in Moncada, but not my favorite option in the world. But again, if you're using the White Sox, he does make some sense. And we have Eugenio Suarez. He comes in at 4K. He smashes lefties and righties. He actually had a slight more power versus, or I should say a little bit more power versus right-handed pitching last season. 301 ISO versus lefties compared to a 302 ISO versus righties. I prefer the lefties versus Spencer Turnbull, but pretty much all the Reds are in play here because of their low price tags, and they have one of the higher totals on the slate. And if you compare it to their price tags, they're pretty much the best value stack on this slate. The Yankees have the highest total on the slate, and they're not that expensive, but the Reds are right up there in terms of point per dollar for stack. So I think Suarez does make some sense here. Again, I prefer the lefties versus Spencer Turnbull, but I like the price tags we're getting in Suarez smash righties and lefties last season. The only downgrade for the Cincinnati Reds is that they're not in Great American Ballpark, which is obviously a little bit of a hit, but I still think they're going to be fine. Mike Moustakas, he's 3,600, and I think he grades out as an excellent play on this slate. Should be batting cleanup, and he's really cheap, and he crushes right-handed pitching. If you're looking at his splits last season, he had a 264 ISO versus them, a 109 WRC plus. I mean, not the greatest numbers in the world, but he still has a ton of power versus righties. And he's really cheap, and the lefties grade out really well versus Spencer Turnbull. And I like the price tag, and the Reds grade out as a really good value option on this slate. So I think Mike Moustakas is a fantastic option, especially at this price tag. He's also eligible at second base as well. Then dropping down to shortstop, it's not as great of a position as a lot of these because I think there's a lot of good spots. I mean, I think there's a lot of good options at almost every position. Shortstop's a little bit lower in the totem pole for me, but there's still some decent options here. So we'll start with Tatis. He comes in at 6K. He's got a massive price tag, but he's been very hot to start the season. And if you're spending up for someone, you can make a case for Tatis, especially if you're just stacking up Coors Field. But I got to be honest, it's going to be really hard to fit him in at a 6K price tag. I'm probably not going to get there myself in cash games, but he still grades out well. He's much better versus lefties, but he's still got really good numbers versus righties. I mean, a 265 ISO, 367 WOBA, 129 WRC plus, and near 600 slugging. A 50% ground ball rate kind of sucks though, and so there's a 31% strikeout rate. But we're in Coors Field, and I mean they're all in play here. I mean, I know it sounds really easy to say it's Coors Field, you can play the bats, but it's pretty much true for the most part. But I do not think it's a must on this slate because Garrett Richards and John Gray are not like trash can pitchers. And also you have the Yankees, which have a higher team total in the slate, and they're also less expensive. So I don't think Coors Field's a must, but they're definitely playable. Same goes for Trevor Story. If you're looking at his splits last season, he actually had more power versus righties, and he is facing a righty. So I think he's definitely in play. You also get a little bit of a discount off Tatis, but 264 ISO, 377 WOBA, 119 WRC plus, 550 slugging. I mean, he's fine. I mean, it's just they're really expensive, but I mean they're fine. I mean, they're still going to be good projection-wise. It's just value-wise, not as much. Now, Gleyber Torres, he got hit with a pitch last night, and he actually left the game, so I'm not sure if he's going to even be in the lineup, but it sounds like from a report I read that he should be good to go, and if that's the case, I'm obviously going to have interest here, because, I mean, all the Yankees make sense here, and they actually got a little bit of a price reduction since I'm not going against the Orioles anymore, but Torres had plenty of power versus righties last season, 256 ISO versus them, 121 WRC+. plus. Weber's not a guy I am scared of, and neither is really anyone Boston's going to throw out at the Yankees. They have the highest team total on these slates, so I think you can feel free to load up the Yankees once again. Then Francisco Lindor, he's 4,400. I already mentioned it, but I do have interest in the lefties here versus the Twins because, anytime the Indians are going up against a righty that's not like a guy like Scherzer or, just like an elite level talent, I'm going to have some interest because they're a team that makes a lot of contact, and just getting contact is something that is pretty much all I can ask for from a team because I hate teams that just strike out a ton. Now, some I'll give a little bit of leeway with, like the Yankees, because they just have just a ton of power in their entire lineup. But the Indians are a team that make high contact. I mean, they got a lot of switch hitters in their lineup, and I think they all make some sense here. They have a team total of near 5, and I think they'll be fine. Lindor's got some pretty good numbers versus righties. 263 ISO, 560 slugging, and your 300 batting average. I don't mind Lindor if you're stacking up the Indians. Then Tim Anderson here, he should be leading off versus the lefty, and we're actually getting a decent price tag on him. Now, he doesn't have the most power in the world, but he had a 326 batting average versus lefties last season. And again, if you're using the White Sox, you can get the leadoff hitter for around 4,000. I think that's fine. So Tim Anderson, I think he's definitely a good option, especially at that price tag. And they have a team total of around 5.37, so I think you're getting good value there. And then Freddie Galvis, 2,800, is staying with those cheap Reds. I mean, he's really cheap. He's actually been pretty decent to start the season, and he's got better splits versus righties. If you're looking at his numbers, he's got near 200 ISO versus them. Numbers aren't going to be great, but he's got some pop, and he's just a cheap part of the Reds. Now, he's not my favorite option in the world because he's going to be hitting near the bottom of the order, but Galvis is okay if you need a cheap option at shortstop. You could also look at Jose Peraza. I believe he's really cheap again, 2,700. Should be leading off versus the lefty, but I just hate using the Red Sox for the most part these days. And plus, the Yankees have a pretty good bullpen, so I'm not really looking to actively target them. Then dropping down to the outfield, we have Charlie Blackmon. He's 5,800. Anytime we're in Coors Field, Charlie Blackmon's in play if he's facing a lefty or if he's facing a righty. If you're looking at his splits last season, obviously great numbers overall versus right-handed pitching. 255 ISO, 387 WOBA, 368 on base percentage. and a 125 WRC plus, 318 batting average, only strikes out 15% of the time. Not 50% of the time, that'd be awful. 15% of the time. So if you have the salary, Blackmon's obviously an elite play. We're in Coors Field, and he smashes right-handed pitching. He's also pretty good versus lefties too, but overall better numbers versus righties. So if you have the money, Blackmon's fine. And Giancarlo Stanton, he's 5,700. If you're stacking up the Yankees, it's hard to leave off the cleanup hitter. Now, he comes in at a very, very expensive price tag, so I'm obviously going to prefer Aaron Judge at 4,600 because you can get over 1,000 savings with Judge, and Judge has been just fine so far to start the season. He's homered in back-to-back games, so I see no reason to force in Stanton over Judge, but I still think he's a fine option. Now, he's got worse splits versus righties compared to lefties. Stanton's an absolute lefty smasher, but he still has a 400 on base percentage versus righties, 128 WRC plus, and your 300 batting average. Walks a lot, only a 156 ISO there compared to a 357 versus lefties. But if you're stacking up the Yankees, I mean, obviously Stanton makes plenty of sense. He's just super, super expensive. Then we have JD Martinez versus a lefty, which is always going to put him in play. Now, I don't know, he really hasn't been doing much so far this season, besides that first game where he scored over 20 points, but anytime he faces a lefty, he has to make it on the list just because of how good his splits are. 482 ISO versus them, a 539 WOBA, 494 on base percentage, 242 WRC plus, which is insane. He has an 887 slugging, over a 400 batting average. Anytime JD's going up against a lefty, he's got to make the list here just because of how good his numbers are. But I'm not really looking to play the Red Sox today because they only have an implied team total of 4.34. And some of the guys are a little bit pricey. Now, there are some decent value options, but the Yankees got a good bullpen, and I just don't really. It's just hard to trust the Red Sox right now, especially with only a low team total of 4.34. And there's just many other good offenses on this slate that I'd rather attack that I think are in better spots. Then we have Trent Grisham. He's in Coors Field. He's really expensive at 4,900, but he's been pretty solid for the most part this season. I mean, the numbers aren't going to be great for him if you're looking at splits, but he's in Coors Field, and he's got the lefty on righty matchup, so yeah, he's got to make the list. Same with David Dahl. He's 4,800, should be leading off for the Rockies, and you get the lefty on righty matchup, and you're in Coors Field, one of the higher team totals on the slate at 5.79. If you're looking at his splits last season versus righties, they're solid. 295 batting average, 516 slugging, 221 ISO, 361 WOBA. He's fine. We're in Coors Field. Anybody in Coors Field is in play. I mean, I sound like a broken record, but it's true. Same goes for Tommy Pham. You can play him too if you're stacking up the Padres or if you're just stacking up Coors Field in general. But I think one of the more popular plays on the entire slate will be Aaron Judge. He comes in at 4,600, which just seems a little bit too cheap, especially for being on a team that has a team total of over 6. And I mean, he smashes righties, he smashes lefties, and we're just getting him at a ridiculously cheap price tag. He should be above 5K. I'm not sure why Stanton's over 1,000 more than Judge, but I'm willing to take the value there, and I think Judge is a fantastic play on the slate. Good versus lefties and righties. Then Kyle Schwarber, 4,400. I mean, I'm not like in love with any of the Cubs today, but versus Trevor Williams, I think the lefties are definitely in play. Anthony Rizzo would qualify as well. Victor Caratini if he's in the lineup. But Kyle Schwarber, 4,400, going against Trevor Williams. Should be in the cleanup spot, and Williams just cannot strike out lefties. If you're going to look at his splits versus left-handed bats, if I can find them. Okay, he only has a 12% strikeout rate versus them compared to 21% versus righties. 393 WOBA and a 226 ISO. I think the lefties are certainly in play versus Trevor Williams. I left off Rizzo and a couple of other guys, but I don't want to have like 60 people here listed because I have a ton, but I definitely think Schwarber's in play versus Trevor Williams, who does struggle with lefties. Then we have Aaron Hicks. He's 4,400. He's got much better splits versus right-handed pitching, and I think all the Yankees are in play here. We're getting him at a decent price tag at 4,400. Again, you can save a lot off of Stanton. So if you want to leave Stanton off, I totally get that at that expensive price tag. But if you're full stacking and you can find the salary for Stanton, I think that's totally fine. But I mean, Judge and Hicks make much better value plays, and Sanchez is cheaper, DJ LeMahieu's cheaper, Gleyber Torres is cheaper. So if I'm probably going to leave one guy off the Yankee stack, I guess it would be Stanton, as scary as that sounds. But if you're just looking for value on the Yankees, it's just, I mean, there's just much better guys that are, not much better guys, but much guys that are priced much better, I should say. But yeah, if you're looking at Hicks splits versus lefties compared to righties, it's going to be much better here. 261 ISO compared to only 114 versus lefties, so I think Hicks is in a pretty good spot here. Then Nick Castellanos, he's 4,000. Always love him versus lefties, but he's not terrible versus righties. He's still got some pop, but I just think the Reds make a decent value stack on this slate, so I don't want to leave him off, and I prefer if he was against a lefty, but I'm not really scared of anyone Detroit's going to throw out at them, so Castellanos is fine at a fair price tag. Eloy Jimenez, he's 4,000. He's got some decent splits versus lefties. Now he's a better hitter versus righties with more power. 264 ISO versus righties compared to 200 versus lefties. But I still like the White Sox here. The Royals bullpen does not scare me. I think Bubic might struggle in his first start, so Eloy's fine. Going to be hitting near the middle of the order. Projected to hit 5th at the moment. Then we have Jesse Winker. He's 3,300. He's a lefty versus Turnbull. If you're looking at his splits versus righties, they are much better versus righties than they are versus lefties. 127 WRC plus, a near 300 batting average, 234 ISO, 371 WOBA. Don't love that they're in Detroit. Wish they were in Great American Ballpark, but still, Turnbull's got a lower strikeout rate versus lefties, and the Reds do grade out pretty well for value today, so I think Winker is fine. Probably one of my favorite plays in the entire slate is Michael Brantley. He's 2,800, and I'm just not sure why DraftKings hates Michael Brantley. If you guys were watching my NASCAR videos, it's kind of like how DraftKings hated Ryan Blaney and Eric Jones for a while because they got plenty of upside, and so does Michael Brantley, but they just kept pricing them way too low in good spots, and this is a very good spot for Brantley going up against Matt Andriese. If you're looking at Michael Brantley's splits versus righties last season, he had a 323 batting average, a 146 WRC plus, 549 slugging, 385 WOBA, 226 ISO. If you're looking at Andriese' splits versus lefties, he's got a decent strike rate at 23%, but you have a 211 ISO versus them, a double-digit walk rate, 24% fly ball rate. So Michael Brantley just grades out as one of the best values on the entire slate. Absolutely love him. I mean, 2,800 is just a ridiculous price tag, especially for someone that's hitting cleanup on the Houston Astros, which has one of the best offenses in the league. And then we have another guy that's just way too cheap. And if you want to use Brantley and Akiyama in the same lineup, I mean, you can pretty much spend up elsewhere, and you should have no problem fitting your pitching in. But yeah, Shogo Akiyama, he's got a really fun name to say, and he should be leading off here versus the righty Spencer Turnbull. And like I've said multiple times, I prefer the lefties versus Spencer Turnbull. I wish they're in Great American Ballpark, but still I think he's going to be fine. He's just really cheap. And again, I like the lefties versus Turnbull. And he grades out as one of the better value options on the entire slate, if not the best value option, him and Michael Brantley. So I think it's going to be pretty much it for the video, guys. I hope I got this in about 30 minutes, 31 minutes, so not too bad. But appreciate you guys watching. And if you haven't already, make sure you leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, like I said, hit that subscribe button. Follow me on the socials. You can support my content over on Patreon starting tomorrow. Don't do it today. Do it tomorrow. And that's pretty much going to be it. And hope that you enjoyed the video. And looking forward to baseball tonight. Got a lot of games going on. A lot of good games as well.